If one day you were given the power to buy anything, no limits, no need to pay a price, what would you choose for yourself? A billionaire believed that money reveals human nature, but when 4 black cards were handed out, the person who left him most speechless was the one who didn't buy a single thing for himself. And that choice changed his life forever. At 47, Ethan lived on the top floor of a luxury building in the heart of the city. From his glass balcony, he could see the city lights stretching all the way to the horizon. The glow many people call a dream, but to him, merely a familiar backdrop. Money had never been a problem, neither had power. Ethan was used to every door opening automatically in front of him, fully booked restaurants suddenly producing the best table, a private jet ready after a single phone call, compliments arriving even faster than his name was spoken. But there was one thing Ethan could not buy, no matter how many times he tried: sincerity. His dates always began the same way: a perfect smile, carefully polished conversation, and a phone was placed face down on the table, until the expensive bottle of wine was brought out. Only then did the eyes across from him truly light up. No one had to say it out loud. Ethan could feel it. He could feel the moment when he was no longer a man, but became a value, an opportunity, a resource. That night, after an evening like so many others, Ethan returned to his vast penthouse. No music, no warm lights, only a silence so loud it was uncomfortable. He took off his coat, tossed it onto a chair, and stood motionless for a long time by the window. The city kept moving. People kept rushing after something. Only he stood still. Ethan suddenly realized a cold truth. The higher he stood, the harder it became to know who was truly standing beside him. The people around him smiled a lot, but he was no longer sure whether those smiles were meant for him or for what he owned. And in that hollow moment, a question suddenly surfaced in Ethan's mind, simple yet haunting. If I gave them everything, would I see who they really are? He didn't know that this question would open the door to a chain of choices that would send his life down a completely different path. That idea did not arrive like a lightning bolt. It came slowly, quietly, much like the way doubt seeps into the mind of someone who has grown far too accustomed to being used. Ethan sat in the spacious living room, the ice in his glass long since melted. Across from him was Mark, the assistant who had been by his side for nearly 10 years, who had witnessed countless deals, both big and small, yet rarely saw his boss this silent. "What are you thinking about?" Mark asked cautiously. Ethan didn't answer right away. He gently rotated the glass, watching the liquid ripple and reflect the ceiling lights. "Have you ever wondered," Ethan said slowly, "what people would reveal if money were no longer a barrier?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "You mean give them everything?" Ethan replied. "No limits, no conditions. No one is watching. And observe." Mark fell silent for a few seconds. He knew this tone very well, the voice of someone who had already made a decision, not someone seeking advice. 4 black credit cards, unlimited spending power, 72 hours, not to impress, not to buy affection, but to test hearts. Ethan didn't call it a game. Deep down, he saw it as a final trial for a faith he had lost long ago. If everyone turned out the same, he would accept that this was human nature, and he would stop expecting more. The list of 4 people was not chosen at random. There was someone who had once been very close to him, but loved only the spotlight. Someone intelligent and sharp who viewed everything as a strategy. Someone who lived in a social world where others' gazes measured worth. And then there was Grace, the woman who quietly appeared every early morning and left when everything was in order. The woman who never stepped into the luxurious living room unless she was called. The woman who always said, "It's okay," exhaustion was clearly written across her face. Ethan realized something strange. He had never truly seen Grace with money in her hands. And it was precisely that silence that made her the most critical piece in this experiment. When Ethan placed the 4 black envelopes on the table, he had no idea that the only person who didn't ask, "What am I allowed to buy?" would be the one who would soon force him to ask himself, "What exactly have I been wrong about all this time?" The 4 black envelopes were handed out that morning. No instructions, no scrutinizing glances, only one brief sentence from Ethan. 3 days. Use it however you want. And then, everything began to speak for itself. The first to leave was Madison. The sound of her high heels echoed across the marble floor, quick and decisive, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Less than an hour later, the first transactions appeared. Luxury fashion boutiques, limited edition accessories, a hastily booked getaway. Madison's world didn't change. It was amplified. Lauren was different. She didn't rush. She didn't shop on impulse. She sat down, opened her laptop, and made a plan. To Lauren, the black card wasn't a reward, it was leverage. Every expense carried the label investment. Training programs, brand consultants, strategic meetings. Everything made sense. And it was also cold, almost devoid of emotion. Vanessa arrived last. She smiled, subtle yet full of confidence. Not until that evening did the transactions begin pouring in. Event venues, decor, guest lists. Vanessa didn't buy objects. She bought attention, bought status, bought recognition. Ethan watched it all in silence until the 4th list appeared. No luxury boutiques, no 5-star hotels, no glittering names. Only a supermarket, a second-hand bookstore, a children's shop, and a large order for a communal kitchen. Ethan leaned forward as if afraid he was seeing it wrong. "What is she buying?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. No one could answer. 3 days passed. 3 choices lay bare, and Ethan suddenly realized something that unsettled him. Everything he had predicted had come true, except for one person. Grace left no loud traces behind, no announcements, no display. Only a void in Ethan's thoughts, a quiet question that kept growing larger. If money reveals human nature, then what exactly is being revealed here? And it was that very question that pushed Ethan to do something he had never done before, step out of his own world to find the answer.
Ethan hadn't planned to go anywhere that afternoon. He was used to letting reports speak in place of people. Numbers had never betrayed him. They were clear, logical, and free of emotion. But this time was different. Grace's transaction list kept resurfacing in his mind, not because of the amount of money, but because of how completely out of sync it was with everything he had ever believed. There was no business logic, no sign of indulgence, only things that seemed to have nothing to do with an unlimited black card. In the end, Ethan drove himself out of Manhattan. The roads he passed through gradually changed. Glass high-rises gave way to old buildings, small shops, walls with peeling paint. The familiar urgency of the financial district faded. All that remained was a slower rhythm of life and something more real. He stopped in front of a modest children's center. No flashy sign, cameras. Just a few children running around the front yard, their laughter so natural it made Ethan pause for a moment. And then he saw Grace. She wasn't wearing a uniform. There was nothing about her that suggested someone who had been granted unlimited spending power. She wore an old t-shirt, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back hastily. She was crouched down at eye level with a child, talking and laughing as if
Time here held no value other than presence. Ethan stood still for a long time. He watched Grace move among the children, busy, a little clumsy, but sincere. She handed out food, taped drawings to the wall, clapped and cheered for a silly game. No one knew who she was, and clearly, she didn't need anyone to know. For the first time in many years, Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Not jealousy, not curiosity, but something unfamiliar. Shame. Shame that he had believed power would expose human nature, because standing before him now was someone who didn't need power to live with decency. Ethan suddenly understood something no financial balance sheet had ever taught him. Some choices don't need to be proven. They only need to be seen. And in that moment, he knew this experiment had gone beyond his control. Not because of Grace, but because he himself was beginning to change. Every change carries its price, and for Ethan, that price arrived sooner than he expected. In the days after that trip, the image of Grace among the children never left his mind, not as a beautiful memory, but as a question without an answer. Each time he stepped into the quiet penthouse, he would unconsciously listen, as if hoping to hear a familiar sound coming from the kitchen. But only silence answered. Then the rumors began. At first, they were whispers within the investment circles. Then came the articles, their headlines carefully chosen to shock. Grace's name appeared alongside words Ethan never imagined he would see. Misuse of charitable funds, exploitation of trust, the housekeeper and the black card. Ethan's phone rang non-stop. Advisors, shareholders, partners, all demanding an explanation. They didn't care who Grace was. They cared only about risk. Ethan felt a familiar pressure. Not the pressure of money, but the pressure of choice. To believe or not to. Believe. To step forward and defend, or to remain silent and stay safe. And in that moment, Ethan hesitated. Not for long, just a single breath. But for Grace, that was enough to say everything. When Ethan found her, Grace didn't raise her voice, nor did she justify herself. She looked at him, her eyes not angry but tired. A kind of weariness that appears only when someone has grown used to being misunderstood. "You've seen everything," she said softly. "If you still have to ask at this point, then I think I should leave." She left the penthouse in silence. No arguments, no tears. Only a neatly folded apron was left on the kitchen table, like a final farewell without words. That night, Ethan sat alone for a long time. No screens, no calls. He came to a belated realization. Trust is not measured by evidence, but by whom we choose to stand with when things become most difficult. And for the first time in his life, Ethan realized there are losses that money cannot repair. The silence after Grace left was unlike any failure Ethan had ever experienced. There were no arguments, no plunging numbers on a screen, only a lingering void, dull and persistent, that made everything around him feel meaningless. Ethan had lost millions of dollars in a single afternoon and still slept soundly. But that night, he couldn't fall asleep. Not because he feared being deceived, but because he feared that he hadn't been brave enough to believe in what was right. The next morning, Ethan did something he had always avoided before. He asked Mark to recheck everything, not to find Grace's faults, but to find the truth. Every transaction was cross-referenced, every receipt was traced, every email, every connection. And the picture slowly came into focus with brutal clarity. Funds taken out of context, photos that had been manipulated, accusations were deliberately constructed. All of it led back to the same point. The people who had once laughed and spoken warmly with Ethan were the very ones who had quietly dragged Grace down. When the truth was confirmed, Ethan didn't feel relieved. He felt heavier, because this truth didn't erase one fact. He had let Grace walk away at the moment she needed protection the most. Without waiting another minute, Ethan left the office and drove straight to the children's center. No notice, no polished words prepared. He carried only one thing with him: acknowledgement. Grace was sitting on the floor, patiently helping a young boy with his exercises. She looked up when she saw Ethan. No surprise, no joy. Just the calm gaze of someone who had grown used to standing back up on her own. Ethan stood there, not stepping closer right away. He took a deep breath. "I was wrong," he said. "No excuses, no deflection. I didn't believe you when I should have believed you the most." Grace was silent for a long time. Then she asked, her voice gentle but precise, "Are you here this time for the truth or for your guilt?" Ethan answered immediately, without hesitation, "For the truth, and because you deserve someone to stand on your side." In that moment, there was no immediate forgiveness, but something more important had been restored: honesty. And sometimes, that is the only starting point a person can hope for. Change does not arrive through grand promises. It comes through small choices, repeated again and again, in silence. After that day, Ethan did not try to pull Grace back with power or money. He understood that if he used those things again, he would return to the same position, standing above, looking down. And this time, he didn't want that. He began showing up at the children's center more often, not as a sponsor or a future founder, simply as a man who arrived early, left late, learned how to stack chairs, wipe tables, and listen. At first, Grace kept her distance, not cold, just cautious. She didn't reject Ethan, but she didn't open up either. Their conversations stayed with the ordinary: the children's lunches, a complex math problem, or a balloon that kept popping because it was overinflated. Ethan didn't push. He learned how to wait. In those tiny moments, Ethan began to understand something he had never considered before. Trust cannot be demanded. It can only be given back. As time passed, things slowly changed. Not loudly, not with declarations. Grace began to talk more, to smile more, and sometimes, when Ethan wasn't paying attention, she let him help with something, tiny, but enough to show that the door was no longer tightly shut. Ethan's penthouse began to change as well, not because of new furnishings, but because weekends started to carry laughter. Children from the center were invited over, not for image, but for connection. Ethan looked around the space that had once felt cold and suddenly realized it no longer felt so large. One evening, after they finished cleaning up, Grace stood by the window looking down at the city. She spoke very softly. "I used to think you were just a wealthy man." Ethan smiled, offering no rebuttal. Grace turned to him, her gaze gentler. "But now, I see you learning how to be a good person." Not praise, nor complete forgiveness, but to Ethan it was the most precious thing he had ever received. Because, for the first time in his life, he understood this: some lives are not changed by money, but by someone choosing to stay, even when leaving would be easier. There was no single moment that clearly marked when everything was okay. Life doesn't work that way. It simply flows on quietly, carrying changes so small that people only notice them when they look back. A few months later, the experiment that once made Ethan believe he could see through people was hardly mentioned anymore. No one talked about the 4 black cards. There were no transaction reports. What had seemed to begin with money ultimately ended with things that could not be priced. Ethan's penthouse was no longer a place to hide from the world. Every weekend, small shoes lay scattered by the door, and laughter echoed from the living room. Children sat sprawled on the floor, scribbling drawings, competing to tell stories with no beginning or end. Ethan often stood leaning against the kitchen counter, quietly watching Grace move through the room. Not as the housekeeper she once was, not as the chosen one in an experiment, but as a natural part of the place, like the afternoon light slipping through the windows. One day, after everyone had gone home, Grace sat down beside Ethan. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The silence between them was no longer heavy, but light enough to remain. "Have you ever thought," Grace said, "that if you hadn't given out those cards that day, things might have turned out differently?" Ethan thought for a long time. Then he answered very slowly, "Maybe. But without them, I would never have known what I was missing." Grace didn't smile. She nodded, as if the answer needed no further comment. Ethan looked out the window. The city was still glowing as brightly as ever, but he no longer felt as though he were standing above it. He no longer had to prove who he was or how much he owned. For the first time, he understood that the loneliest thing about being at the top is not the lack of people around you, but the lack of someone willing to look at you as an ordinary human being. Grace had done that, not with money, not with promises, but simply by living true to what she believed. And Ethan realized that some stories do not end with a perfectly wrapped conclusion. They end with a silence deep enough that people carry it with them for a long time, even after the video has stopped playing. Some stories don't close with a dazzling moment. They don't need applause, nor a line that says, "happily ever after." They leave behind something very gentle, yet deep enough for people to carry with them. For Ethan, what remained was not a lesson about money, nor the sense of victory when the truth was exposed. What remained was a change in the way he looked at people. He no longer walked into meetings thinking, "What do they want from me?" Instead, he asked himself, "What am I bringing into their lives?" Ethan was still rich, still busy, still living in a city that never sleeps. But on some evenings, he left the office a little earlier, not because of his schedule, but because he knew that somewhere else there were people who didn't care who he was, only whether he showed up or not. Grace didn't change the world. She didn't try to teach Ethan to become someone else. She lived true to herself, and that alone was enough to shake every old belief Ethan had once relied on to survive. Once, as they were seeing the children off, Ethan asked Grace, "Do you ever regret not choosing an easier life for yourself?" Grace thought for a few seconds, then replied, "Easy isn't always peaceful. I choose what lets me sleep at night." Ethan said nothing, because he understood, after a very long time, he had finally begun to sleep well again. This story doesn't say that money is bad. It doesn't say the wealthy must give up everything. It simply reminds us of one straightforward thing. The actual value of a person is revealed most clearly when they have the power to choose, and still choose, kindness. If you stayed until this very second, perhaps it wasn't because you were curious about how the story would end, but because somewhere within you, you are also asking yourself what you would choose when no one is forcing you to choose anymore. And perhaps that very question is the most essential thing this story leaves behind. The story does not end with a great decision. There is no moment of declaration, no spotlight, no closing applause. It ends with a very ordinary afternoon. Ethan stood by the window looking down at the stream of people passing below. The city was still as noisy as ever. The pace of life was still hurried. But for the first time in many years, he no longer felt as though he was standing outside of it all. He understood something then. What had changed was not his circumstances, but the way he was present in other people's lives. Ethan once believed that power gave him the right to choose, but grace taught him a different lesson. Choice matters only when we are not choosing for ourselves. None of the children knew who Ethan was, and strangely enough, that made him feel lighter. No more proving himself. No need to be above anyone. Just being there. Grace remained the same. No change, no embellishment, no need to see herself as special. She didn't view what she did as a sacrifice. It was simply a way of living that allowed her heart to be at peace when night fell. And perhaps that peace is the rarest thing in this world. Ethan had once stood at the very top where everything could be bought. But up there, he was alone. Now, standing among simple things, he finally understood. It's not the person who gives you the most who stays the longest, but the one who gives without needing to be seen. This story does not tell you who you must become. It does not ask you to give anything up. It quietly places a single question before you, one that perhaps everyone should ask themselves at least once in life. When no one is watching, when no one is judging, what kind of person will you choose to be? If you've walked with this story all the way to the final moment, perhaps it wasn't because of the plot, but because somewhere within you, something has just been touched. Deep Life Tales tells stories not to teach you how to live, but to remind you that quietest choices are often the ones that shape an entire lifetime. If this story made you think, leave a comment. Even a single dot is enough. And if you'd like to continue along with stories like this, please like, share, and subscribe to Deep Life Tales. We'll meet again in another story at a moment when you need it most.